begin with this. Well, thank you all for being here. This is the November 21st session of Hesperides, and we have today Leonardo Velloso-Lyons. Now, the presentation for today is a little bit different from those that we usually have here at Hesperides, or we have had during the recent sessions, because Leo will not be giving a sort of conventional paper on reception. He will be talking about a particular case study of rhetorical elements embedded in geographical and historical descriptions of the early modern period related to the Ibero-Lusophone world, of course. But he will not be making explicit allusions to the classical apparatus, right, that subtends his reading. So in a way, I wanted to start, before we begin with the presentation proper, by inviting the audience to actually pay a particular type of attention to his presentation. We would want you to try to actually help us produce explicitly the connections between what he will be discussing in his paper and the classical, tradition that we, some of you are particularly acquainted with. There is a lot of Quintilian, there is a lot of Aristotle, there is a lot of Varro, Cicero, in the substratum of the paper. And something that would be very timely, very useful, would be for grounding those connections during the Q&A. So we want this to have the shape not simply of a conventional presentation, but also a little bit of a workshop-like element, wherein we can actually collaborate with Leo, and also, try to identify the way in which our expertise in the classical world has a bearing, right, even in those elements that don't explicitly refer to the classical world, right, but are clearly connected to it. So without further ado, I want to introduce Leo. Leo is an assistant professor from Emory University, and he's currently working on a project on the implementation of rhetorical figures in early modern descriptions of Africa. This presentation is a component of that project, so I will just cede the word to Leo. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Germán, and thank you all at Hesperides for having me, even though, as I was saying, it's like whenever I speak to classicists, I always feel a bit intimidated. So I'm very, very glad to be here sharing my work with you. That is deeply steeped in rhetoric and classical rhetorical traditions, but also with a twist of the early modern period, as Germán said. So I'm going to share my screen here, and this should go no longer than 40 minutes. So again, I just would like to thank the organizing committee of Hesperides for having me, in particular, my colleague Germán Campos Munoz, who invited me to share my research and thoughts with you today. And although I was initially taken a little bit aback with the invitation, like, what do I have to say to a group dedicated to the study of classical literature in the early modern Ibero-Oceanic world? I don't closely work on Latin material, even if the material is somewhat unavoidable to a certain extent. And that's sort of the premise of what I'm here sharing with you. And thank you to everyone who has kindly taken the time to come here to listen to what I have to say at the end of the semester. That's particularly appreciated. So when I was thinking what I could possibly share that would be of interest to this audience and also would help me in a way, like because I don't present my work to classicists and people who work deeply in classical reception, I felt like presenting my research as it is, because of how much rhetoric plays an important role in my current book project, alongside a meandering through one particular rhetorician, Neo-Latin rhetorician, with whom I don't quite know what to do yet. I thought that would do the trick. So pardon me if this seems loosely connected, but they're going to tie at the conclusion, the two things that I want to share. So you will all know that the history of how Europeans have imagined Africa neither begins nor ends with the imperial ventures of the Spanish and the Portuguese in the early modern period. Yet, it is still difficult to overstate their impact on our shared world. These encounters included the introduction of the Atlantic slave trade, the establishment of colonial settlements on 4 continents, the exploitation of untold peoples and natural resources, the founding of religious missions, and much more. So my current book project adds to our understanding, and just to confirm, you can see my screen, right? it will be black sometimes, and that's okay. Just to tell you. My current book projects add to understanding of that legacy with a specific focus on histories written in different parts of the Ibero-Atlantic empires. Tentatively called Figaro Africa, Rhetoric, History, and the Hinterlands in the Early Modern Ibero-Atlantic, I examine how a group of early modern historians theorized Africa for their readers, in doing so, constructing racialized geographic identities that could rationalize European colonial projects around the globe. My findings show that these historians did this in ways that not only contributed to, but also transcended the more common colonialist image of the African continent as a provider of human labor and raw materials that modern scholars have so avidly fought against. While diverse orders of knowledge, cartographic, ethnographic, antiquarian, historical, geographic, and so forth, shape each of these historians' writings, there is a common thread. Underpinning each is an unmistakably ambivalent rhetorical framework, a framework that acknowledges the centrality of Africans in the Ibero-Atlantic world, while also striving to limit their actual and symbolic influence by assigning them a flat, racialized geographic identity. Africa, and a fortiori African peoples, are once a historiographical hinge for these writers and a side note. These Ibero-Atlantic accounts of Africa work to reduce the continent to a series of transposable figures of thought that then could be used to understand and evaluate non-African peoples and places. In many ways, the legacy of this kind of rhetorical thinking is not far from how racialized geographic epithets are still used to this day to refer to some communities, Africans and Afro-descendants being one of them. For today's talk, I'll focus on one of the 6 authors I discuss in my book, and and one of 3 figures of thought. I'll give you a brief overview so that you know where what I'm sharing today is situated in the project. Figaro Africa is a book divided in 3 parts, with each dedicated to a pair of historians whose works captured a particular way of thinking about Africa and Africans. I start with Bartolomé Las Casas and João de Barros in the 1560s and their uses of simile to compare horizons of expectations between Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In a sort of introductory chapter, this first pair of authors is global in outlook, bearing the mark of the burgeoning oceanic imperial perspective so aptly described by scholars of the early modern period, and thus so indebted to such scholars, my project. In part 2, I turn to Miguel Cabello Balboa and André Álvares de Almada in Ecuador and Cabo Verde in the 1580s and 90s to show how they represent Africa through synecdoche to impose order on the entangled histories of Iberia, Africa, and the Americas. André Álvares de Almada is the example I have for you today, and synecdoche, the figure of thought I'll be speaking about. Finally, in part 3, I turn to Felipe Guampoma de Ayala and Alonso de Sandoval in Peru and New Granada in the 1610s and 20s to show how their treatment of Africa is characterized by oxymoron, as they seek to stabilize a global localized world by affixing immutable racialized geographic identities. These last 2 pairs of historians, Cabello, Almada, Guampoma, and Sandoval, marks a shift in focus from the global and oceanic outlooks of Barros and Las Casas onto writers who were responding to their local contexts, be that Ecuador, Senegambia, Peru, or Nueva Granada, where they encountered Africans and Afro-descendants firsthand, even while they were writing. Their writing evokes the transcendent claims of Las Casas or Barros. In other words, their writings demonstrate an effort to negotiate between the oceanic and transcontinental dimension of the Iberian colonial project and the social and racial relations they directly observed. Each of these historians occupies a particular vantage point of sorts, prompted by their own ideas about the role of their local reality in the burgeoning empire that purported to be global. Each of them negotiated between 2 versions of an imagined African continent, one forged in their readings about it, which included various domains of knowledge that circulated through the Ibero-Atlantic, and included, obviously, classical works like Pliny, Strabo, Ptolemy, and so forth, and another shaped by their contacts with Africans and Afro-descendants in their local places of writing. In a way, and I'm happy to elaborate that during the conversation that will follow the talk, each historian I examine in the 2nd and 3rd parts of my book is making sense of the world around them in ways that prefigure the modern conundrum Stuart Hall talks about when tackling the concept of identity in a progressively more globalized world. For Hall, separating what is global from what is local in this globalized world, a globalization shaped by the movement of peoples, forced or willing, is extremely difficult. Yet I feel compelled to do so. And perhaps that's why he resorts to theory to unpack the conundrum, and I too inspired by his move. As he puts it, and I quote him, "Theory is always a detour on the way to something more important," end quote. All of this to say that the book is unashamedly theoretical, but usually when I give talks about this project, I leave a theory that underpins it under my sleeve, so to speak, hoping that people will pick up on it, but not forcing anyone to do so. Because of this workshop nature that Herman and I talked about, that I could take advantage of my presentation at Hesperides, I feel compelled to show my cards a bit more, especially when given the fact that rhetoric, both as a theoretical horizon and a historicist endeavor, plays such a role in how I read these historians. In a nutshell, what I'm proposing is that we read early modern histories through the notions of figures of thought, because what I see in these historical works is not just simile, synecdoche, or oxymoron as simple figures of speech, that is, figures functioning at the sentence level in ways that the various 16th century rhetoric manuals that circulated in Spain could help you identify them. Rather, the operations I describe with this book are manners of thinking and reasoning that point to a fundamental epistemological problem at the center of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, the unrealizable promise of a truly globalized world. In highlighting these historians' rhetorical operations happening beyond sentence level, my goal is to shed new light on the notions of oceanic and global that have so profoundly influenced the field of early modern studies, as well as tap into what historical writing meant, both in each specific context of production and in the broader Ibero-Atlantic world. Here, I'm absolutely evoking Hayden White's work, as well as topological thinking about literature that was so particularly influential in the United States some decades ago. Both of those with a bit of a Silver Winter twist, who was an important thinker for me, with a specific eye to how underlying notions of poetics and rhetoric shape these works in their representation of alterity. And again, I'm happy to elaborate that in conversation. Now, on to part one of this talk, which is dedicated to synecdoche and will take us to Senegambia. As you likely know, synecdoche is a figure of speech that describes the use of a part of something to represent the whole or the whole for the part. And just to give two expressions for you to latch onto, all hands on deck would be one, boots on the ground would be another example, a sentence level synecdoche. But the synecdoche that I'm proposing as an analytical category, however, it's more elaborate than that of sentence level because it takes many different parts introduced over the course of a longer historiographical work and condenses them into a falsely homogeneous whole. This operation can only be accounted for by assembling the many moments where the different parts of the whole point, albeit subtly, to the implied whole, which culminates in an idea of Africa, to borrow Valentin Yves Mudimbe's expression. One of the most lasting effects of Ibero-Atlantic expansion is the reduction of African ethnic, cultural, geographical complexity into a univocal image, a problem that has puzzled specialists in literary studies, cultural studies, historians, philosophers, classical studies, and so forth. My book project aims to contribute to the ongoing debates about African presence in the Ibero-Atlantic by showing how this racialized vision of Africa takes shape in histories through figures of thought. So I'm going to focus on this historian or treatise writer, André Álvares de Almada, who is one of the two historians whose writings I see as exemplifying the creation of a synecdochal Africa. André Álvares de Almada wrote in the 1590s a short treatise about Senegambia from the vantage point of Cape Verde, describing the various groups he knew from the region, their cultural and religious practices, their strategic importance for the imperial endeavor, for the Portuguese imperial endeavor, and some sprinkled throughout the work, individual stories about the dealings between Europeanized Cape Verdeans and the various African sovereigns with whom these traders engaged in commerce. It is crucial to bear in mind that Almada, mixed-race writer who would have promptly identified with Portugal more than with Senegambia, was in contact with African subjects and sovereigns. And while my focus today is on how his work seeks to flatten the complexity of his observed reality through synecdochal writing about the region and its peoples, many moments in his work expose the limits of his ability to do so, where accounts of African places and peoples resist the simplistic racialized geographic identity that Almada sought to ascribe to them. So he wrote his Tratado dos Reinos da Guiné do Cabo Verde, 1594, for the Habsburg monarch Philip II. That's who is intended to. The Tratado is a weird work, so to speak. It combines different genres and domains of knowledge, but it is rather short if compared to most works that I analyze in my book. There's also the issue of audience. Unlike the other historians' works, scholars don't seem to have been part of the intended audience that Almada had in mind, but rather officers and administrators who were dealing with Senegambian sovereigns. The Tratado is at once a historical, ethnographic, topographic, and economic treatise focused on the peoples and lands between the Senegal River and the Sierra Leone mountain range. And its subject matter, according to Almada, is, and I quote briefly in English, the weapons, garments, and customs of the blacks, their wars, their opinions, and everything else that is noteworthy in these lands, end quote. Given this, the Tratado is part of a long tradition of colonialist travel writing that aimed to inform Iberian officials of the different possibilities for imperial expansion. However, the Tratado is unique among Portuguese sources on Africa from this time because it best embodies the preoccupation with the possible collapse of the Iberian colonial enterprise in West Africa. Just as an imagined Africa plays a key rhetorical role in the works of the other historians I discuss, serving as a foil for Iberia and a historical precedent for Peru and Ecuador, or as the foil onto which to project a Spanish globalized imperial world of fixed racial categories, Almada's view of West Africa is inseparable from his broader concern with Portuguese claims to Brazil, East Timor, Goa, Morocco, Mozambique, Macau, pressured by both other European powers and local sovereigns, as it was in the very late 16th century. And the following passage on rural Senegal will encapsulate these concerns. Os nossos que estão na aldeia têm tratos para os outros rios e para a costa, onde vão e mandam tratar em lanchas e outras embarcações com os ingleses e franceses. E o pior é que levam as ditas partes escravos a vender aos jalofos, reading selections, que muitos deles podiam ser cristãos e dessa maneira não são. E além de o não serem, se vendem alguns aos mouros, o que se deve sentir. Os negros dessa terra, os cortesãos que andam da corte dos reis com quem tratam os nossos, andam vestidos com umas roupetas compridas e uns panos cingidos, e por debaixo desses panos trazem uma pele. Os mais do sertão andam nus e não trazem mais que a pele. The passage contains many of the motifs that pervade the whole tratado. Almada's preoccupation with cultural dominance as expressed in customs and patterns of interaction, and his description of African peoples as decreasing in civilization the further they live from the coast. In the interest of time, I'll focus on one element in his depiction of the competition for cultural control, the figure of the lançado, Portuguese or Luso-African colonists who lived among the Wolof, the Mandinka, and other West African groups. Portugal and Spain needed individuals to learn the languages, ways, and customs of the indigenous peoples that were to enter the imperial sphere of influence, and to develop a space where lançados might undertake such learning opportunities without risking the loss of their allegiance. There are already such established spaces in metropolitan centers such as Mexico City and Cusco, but in the empire's hinterlands, questions of allegiance and becoming, that is, who could become like whom, were central. So here's one such example from the Tratado. And I will go straight to my discussion of it because I kind of summarized this very, very long quote. So buried in the Almada's criticism of lançados, and he tells here the story of João Ferreira. And the story of João Ferreira is essentially a story of two African sovereigns. One who sends João Ferreira into the hinterlands, and another who convinces him to marry into his family, and even broken deals between his community and Portugal's European rivals. My claim is that this story, much like the structure of the work itself, is made to lift enormous representative weight in encapsulating the whole of West Africa and the Portuguese conundrum there. The problem is that these individual stories that function as parts to a whole may sometimes upset the intended whole. Right, and he talks about like how João Ferreira goes like following the orders of someone. He goes to another sovereign and marries with the sovereign's daughter, and begins to participate in the community and broker deals between that particular sovereign's community and Portugal's rivals. To understand how Almada's synecdochal framing of West Africans works against the individual examples he registers in Tratado, we have to take a look at this structure. So each chapter is dedicated to a particular group of West Africans, the Wolof, the Mandinka, the Fula, and then it goes along like many other groups, except for the very last chapter. But all descriptions are subject to a homogenizing synecdoche that privileges the whole as an explanatory factor for each part that the reader would learn from each chapter. And this is an important operation here. This operation of the whole for the individual parts is set forth right in the prologue. There, he introduces his reader to the archival problems posed by a nossa África. Entre os negros da nossa África não houve escritores, nem entre eles se ousou escrever coisa que lhe se possa, posto que nesse gentio há uns negros tidos por religiosos, chamados bichirins, os quais escrevem em papel e em livro encadernados de quarta e meia folha. Mas de tal maneira são suas escrituras que não podem servir a outrem, nem de outrem serem entendidas mais do que as escrevem. Porque mais são certos sinais e particulares concetas que letras inteligíveis. E como assim seja, não se pode saber as coisas notáveis que entre eles passaram, posto que seu costume seja trazê-las por histórias. Porque como a memória dos homens não possa compreender muito, suposto que tudo compreenda, não se pode reter tanto que a continuação do tempo o não gaste e consuma. Pelo que não podemos saber deles mais que as coisas que eles hoje retêm na memória, porque as que naqueles tempos antigos passaram, posto que dignas de eterno nome, os tempos as gastaram. Thus, from the very beginning of his work, Almada unites these communities into a whole in three ways. The epithets that he deploys to refer to all of them in one golpe de vista or vistazo, negros da nossa África, highlights his skin color, one single aspect of these humans, to encompass them all. Two, in terms of their generalized lack of alphabetic literacy, though he does contradictorily dismissively mention something that resembles a script, right? And the forgetting of the past that supposedly accompanies this lack of written culture. And three, in terms of their relationship with the past, which cannot go beyond the limits of memory, thus consigned to only a few years back. For Almada, these people are all the same because they look the same, they are incapable of producing legible written language, and they are destined to live in a perpetual present, more so the more they live in the interior. Within the literate-illiterate divide that Almada constructs, what is at stake here is the very possibility of history. Almada uses this divide to commodify and fetishize the different West African peoples he discusses. His is a totalizing project, synecdochal from the whole on the prologue, in which Senegambia peoples are part of a generalized African whole that is essentially inferior to that of Portugal or its assimilated colonies, such as Cape Verde. How then can these West African groups, who according to Almada can barely write or keep records of their own past, pose any threat to the Iberian colonial enterprise? It is important to keep in mind that the two poles of Almada's civilizational quote-unquote value are also geographic. Only that when we look into the role that each of those parts play, once Almada begins to scrutinize it with each chapter dedicated to a particular group of people, these individual stories that are supposed to stand in for the whole and confirm what he sets forth in the prologue seem to be responding back to the Portuguese colonial advances in Senegambia. When Lançados move away from the Iberian influence on coastal West Africa and journey inland along the rivers, when they join the parts of that homogeneous whole that he posits in the prologue, they risk absorption into the alterity of an imagined Africa without history or time or conformity to Iberian notions of order. And although Almada himself is a mestizo, mixed race, he does not identify whatsoever with the West African cultures he describes. This is part of his rhetorical strategy, and that is so different from the one later employed by other historians, and the one that sparks this project is Inca Garcilaso da Vega. Ask me in the Q&A if you want to know about it. Since his goal is to frame implicitly Cape Verde as quintessentially Iberian, an example of successful imperial assimilation in contradistinction to the unassimilated peoples of inland West Africa, whose apparent influence over the Lançados epitomizes their threat to the Iberian Empire and legitimizes the urgency of Almada's entreaty to Philip II. It is therefore unsurprising that complaints about Lançados litter the pages of Almada's treatise. And now I want to go to the second part of this talk. Right. Now let me shift gears a bit to tackle some ideas I have and offer you a peek behind the curtain, so to speak. Part of the role of that rhetoric plays in how I conceptualize rhetoric in my project is theoretical, and much indebted to scholars who have thought about rhetoric beyond its persuasive function and have explored the ways in which tropes and figures of speech have epistemological valences that the sentence level cannot quite capture. This will resonate with an audience of classicists, right? The other part, as I have said earlier today, is more historicist in this sense. And to the Brazilians who may be in the call, mainly inspired by João Adolfo Hansen, and for my colleagues from Mexico, Perla Chinchilla Pauling, rhetoric was the water in which the historians swam and was an integral part of education throughout the Ibero-Atlantic. And the metaphor I choose here of water in which they swam is very intentional. Just like Antonio Vieira's fish in his Sermão de Santo Antonio cannot see the water in which it swims, some of these rhetorical moves I read in the work of the six historians may not be as intentional as that of a poet who's carefully choosing each word to fit the confines of the chosen form of expression. So let's dive into this detour of Vivas's book 3 of De Ratione di Kendi with that in mind. More specifically, I want to discuss two concepts around which he organizes book 3, narration and description, narratio and descriptio. I must disclose here one bias. Between the two concepts, narration is the most important to me, but increasingly I look at description with curious eyes. Narration for Vives includes dealing with the differences between the various kinds of narrative, history, epic, fables, and so forth in Book 3. Vives gets into history by means of comparing it to epic, that is, the former are narratives that are dedicated to the truth, that would be history, and the latter, as well as fables, are dealing with imitation, affording the writer some degree of liberty in how to express an idea. My goal here is not to reconstruct the conceptual horizon of Vives's capacious notion of rhetoric, though it is important to me to some extent, which blends the writing of history, epic, fables, slick poetry, in some political speeches, in some every form of writing, including writing whose aim is not only to persuade, but also to represent. The second disclaimer relates, and I will offer a second one, to how my own interests shape how I read Vives. As you know, my research focuses on history, less so on the ars historicae of early modernity, and I'm thinking here of the usual suspects from the Iberian world, Luis Cabrera de Córdoba and Sebastián Fox Morcillo, and more on individual historians writing from different places in the Spanish and Portuguese empires and constructing various figurative ideas of Africa. While epic is not a subject I deal with, when I come to Vives, history and epic poetry then appear as a subject matter related, especially the discussion of epic poems qua histories, or the particular distinctions that authors attribute to each kind of writing. That is, what qualifies a work as an epic poem versus a history, regardless of the medium in which they were written, prose or verse. And here Lucan comes to mind, right, who was read as a historian. What I find very capacious about Book 3 in particular is that Vives dedicates it to creating a typology of persuasive discourse that includes various genres and is somewhat agnostic about the medium in which they were written. Let me look closely at Vives's distinction between narratio and description. And here I'm using David Walker's translation into English. It's a very good bilingual edition. Explaining the full flow of past or future events or things of that sort is called narration, of which there are many kinds. When fixed or as it were stable things are explained, we use description, such as of a house, of summer, winter, spring, for those things which stand still are described without regard for time, namely the condition and appearance of time in the countryside, in the heavens, in men, although these things are often confused, so that what is narrated is said to be described, just as, contrary-wise, what is described is said to be narrated. That's from paragraph 1, book 3. And then I continue. For a better understanding, we shall distinguish narration from description. A description is like a painting on a panel. Narration is a methodical presentation of one thing after another, the way things appear to someone who's riding in a carriage or a litter, facing backwards, who can only see what is passing by. Nor is there any other way of seeing in this life in which we look back on the past, but cannot see the future and see the present only poorly and imperfectly. In the most basic sense, Vives distinguishes narration from description by resorting to metaphors of movement, or lack thereof, painting for description and movement in time for narration. And although not entirely original, these two metaphors work opposite one another to help us here in my deriving an idea of descriptive moments that are crucial for us to think of how these, as we have seen in Almada, fit into the broader historical view of the 16th century Senegambian present. Any collection of words representing the flow of time, past and future, although he dismisses future in the second paragraph, right, would be narrative, whereas representations that are, from the point of view of the writer, still disregarding time are descriptions. Vives complains about the fact that these are often confused, insisting that it is much simpler. If there's some flow of time, it is a narration. If time is still, description. But then again, the question about the notion of time here. In this very basic, albeit opposing, set of definitions, it sounds quite difficult to completely separate them in terms of how these moments can be distinguished in a text like a history. History being the genre of narrative dedicated to truth and to the flow of time, narrative by excellence, but it also allows for some moments of variation, varietas, in order to let the reader breathe. And that's one thing that Vives says, and you can find that in Erasmus as well. And history then becomes a much more malleable genre. Nevertheless, I still want to work through this as a means to talk about what Vives seems to capture in his distinction, which, for the lack of a better word, I just want to call like a writing impulse or something. In paragraph 2, then, he deploys the two sort of commonplace metaphors. A carriage to talk about narrative, the passenger sat with their backs turned to where the carriage is headed, seeing only what goes by, but not what is in front in the carriage, right? and a painting to talk about description, evoking not only color, depth, shade, but also the perspective of the observer in front of it, which is still. It is this perspective of the observer, included in Vives' metaphors to differentiate narration from description, that I want to suggest we hold on to and at times giving their readers an observation from a still standpoint. Description. In that sense, not just epic narratives, but historiographical ethnographic works like Tacitus' Germania and political works like Cicero's speeches would be full of those descriptions, pauses in the flow of time, where language is the means for a writer to carefully lay out the shape of a people, a region, or an entire race, or an argument, as some classical rhetoric would have it. The need Vives describes that every writer has to abide by, in their imposing some order of presentation onto the reader, in depicting something or someone, is necessitated by the medium, words. But the point of view that such moments must consider is, as Vives' initial metaphor would have, a still point of view. It is thinking of the interplay between narration and description in the work of a rhetorician like Vives that makes me think that we should not just think of how each figure's speech is laid out as laid out by rhetoric manuals. And I can think of like Quintilian is a good example, like tracing them very carefully, or not fits or not the chosen mode of expression of a historian they're depicting African Africans. Rather, as good rhetoric would demand from writers who learned from the classics how to carry out their works, these condensed moments of description that order the eye of the reader, appealing to their senses or imagination, moments that bring about a stoppage of time, as if the carriage of the narrative halted for the observer to gaze at what is being brought before their eyes. These moments are crucial for us to read from them what rhetoric does beyond the sentence level, connecting expression, elocutio, with epistemological stakes. And I think here in Wenzio, right, that's part of that operation, that so many philosophers, early modern and modern, have striven to alert us. So let me just conclude with a few thoughts, and I'll be done very shortly. And I will bring because I'm going to bring a second example from the book to compare it, because it's more closely related to Vives as someone who had a Jesuit training. The tendency to homogenize and other Africans in Africa was not uncommon among early modern writers in the Ibero-Atlantic world. Many simply repeated some tropes developed in antiquity. What strikes me in the cases of Almada, however, and more explicitly in another historian discussed in my book, Alonso de Sandoval, is that this strategy invites a troubling contradiction. Their respective efforts to depict Black Africans as mutable partially backfire. For Almada's Lançados, the process of colonial acculturation is shown to be happening in reverse, and the urgency of colonial expansion is legitimated through the representation of a threatening, looming, yet also enticing Africa, which could swallow European norms like it swallowed many Lançados. For Sandoval, and I'm thinking here of his treatise on the Instauranda, written in Spanish. For Sandoval, the then globalized reality of the Iberian Oceanic Empire under one crown should have just been an early modern continuation through Christianity of Europa's ancient rule over Africa, Asia, and more recently, the Americas. But the ubiquitous presence of very different, and here I'm using the words that he uses, right? Ethiopians or Negros, Black people, everywhere, where said empire reached, makes that rule all but impossible to maintain. Each historian builds a narrative in which diverse groups become strategically flattened. I call these geographic identities racialized because these are not simply geographic. They cannot be made sense of through cartography alone. I call these racialized identities geographic because they cannot likewise simply be called racialized in our terms today, as both histories include examples of the instability of these racialized categories, Africans who may become Iberian or vice versa, or Ethiopia functioning not just as a racialized marker, but as an increasingly existential one that spreads beyond its geographic confines in Sandoval. Instead, the Iberian and African identities that emerge out of Almada's and Sandoval's works are racialized, insofar as these rely on essentialized and contrasting characteristics that they attribute to each identity in order to separate them. They then use this racialized geographic separation of identities in their histories to argue for an uneven distribution of power for the benefit of Iberian peoples across the Atlantic. In the end, however, both works expose how the African other is an integral component of the Iberian story. The preoccupation that both texts have around the question of what is African and what is Iberian, a question that sounds more geographic than what meets the eye, is a signal of how vexed and crucial this question was in the context of the 16th and 17th century Ibero-Atlantic world, with people of different origins moving across the three continents, many times forcibly so. Does it matter then that these writers look to an idea of Africa to understand the Spanish and Portuguese oceanic empires? Of course it does. Through a close reading of historical literary works from this period, we expose the complex and high-stakes acts of figuration that produced a homogenized but conflicting Africa as the foil for Iberian and later indigenous American identities. As I have stated in the beginning of this talk, each pair of historians in my book gives us insight into how Africa is imagined through figures of thought in relation to particular territories of the Ibero-Atlantic. First as simile in the works of Las Casas and João de Barros in the 1560s, then as synecdoche in Cabello Balboa and Álvares de Almada in the 1580s and 90s, and finally as oxymorons in Guamão Poma and Sandoval in the 1610s and 20s. As I hope is now somewhat clearer, I do not see these as simple figures of speech, but rather as manners of thinking and reasoning that point to a fundamental epistemological problem at the center of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. In essence, no one can know the empire or even theorize it completely. All these historians who were invested in theorizations of the whole empire were only seeing parts of it. Even these global outlooks are no more than localized figure understandings of the Iberian oceanic empires that purport to be universal. Each of these figures of thought as deployed by historians reflect how they mobilize knowledge of Africa in their works, creating a specular but refracted relationship between Africa and other continents, not unlike what I discuss with respect to some maps in my book. The Ibero-Atlantic space is born out of the Spanish and Portuguese imperial ventures. The Ibero-Atlantic space born out of the Spanish and Portuguese imperial ventures implicated a multitude of places, peoples, practices, and perspectives, whose complexity eludes both narrative and cartographic accounts. What any one person can encounter is always a part, an aspect, a facet, a single piece that makes up the messy jigsaw puzzle that is the burgeoning early modern Iberian world. Small, even isolated events and contexts are made to lift enormous weight as these historians attempt to figure out their surroundings, how their surroundings fit into an empire that is explicitly global. This figure way of knowing, that is the manner these historians make truth claims about the entire world, may stem from a real preoccupation shared by those who engaged in the Ibero enterprise. No individual can ever fully grasp it. My hope is that my concern with figures of thought in the early modern Ibero-Atlantic historiography can help us see the pitfalls and inherent contradictions of this colonial discourse. A Spanish and Portuguese problem, but also a global one. An early modern problem, but also a contemporary one. I look forward to suggestions, comments, and thoughts, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Leo. There was a little bit of a connection issue on my side, but I don't think it affected you, right? At a certain moment. Oh, that's okay. Well, thank you so much. I have a bunch of questions, and before we started the session, I was telling Leo how, some of the concepts that he was sharing with us reminded me sharply of what Chino Achebe discussed in his 1975 lecture on Joseph Conrad, right? And Heart of Darkness. There's a moment in which Achebe focuses particularly on that description of limbs and rolling eyes, right? And holdings. And Achebe is particularly concerned about how that selection of parts, right? It's meant to provide an entire image of Africa, right? In a sort of abusive, brutal form of synecdoche. Now, the fascinating thing is that in that example, right, the vision of the African, right, that is made of limbs and whatnot, is also happening in a sort of combination of narratio and descriptio. It's a descriptio because it shows all these parts, but it is happening through the literal flow of the steamboat that is, going down the river in the Congo Basin, right? So I wanted to bring this up, and furthermore, just to put like the little cherry on top of it, Heart of Darkness, just like Almeida, seems to be concerned about the danger of assimilation, right? And that is actually what happens to Kurtz, right? He gets trapped by the heart of darkness and transformed, right? The European turned a savage, right? So it seems that there is an interesting lineage connecting this 19th century English colonialism to the early modern cases that you are discussing, back to the long-standing tradition of rhetorical education, right? That goes back to antiquity. So I wanted to start by posing two rhetorical questions, and sorry for the silly pun, right? The first is: isn't racism inevitably synecdochic, right? In as much as it picks something, right, surface-based, in order to make an assessment and a proposition about the entirety or about a whole. And the second question is: isn't narration a sort of sine qua non of the scriptio, in as much as it provides the framework or the vantage point in your own terms from which the description can be provided, right? And I want to start these very abstract questions, right, to then try to redirect them to the material and historical elements that you have been discussing. But just as somebody who doesn't come from this particular field of expertise, I'm wondering about, the resonances between the value of these rhetorical figures, right, in certain political operations, like the racialization of an entire geographical part of the world, right? And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to start with.
All right. Thank you so much, Herman, for this question. So you went to two of like very dear figures for me. And so let me start with that one. Absolutely, Chinua Achebe's reading of Conrad is present in this project. And I mean, I could go on and talk about like how, like years ago I read Things Fall Apart, and I started obsessing about Achebe's, not just as a writer. Like I find that novel like so not synecdochial and simplifying in a way, like much more the other operation, like complexifying through the part, right, and never achieving a whole. If we were to apply the same kind of reading, like what Things Fall Apart does, is like kind of like turn Heart of Darkness on its head in many ways. But his reading of Conrad for sure, because I think that I keep struggling with how I start the book, and I don't know if I go to a modern like essayist thinker or like an example in literary, but yes, Heart of Darkness is an example of like that kind of simplification. I think that Chinua Achebe is like very, very apt in his reading of how Conrad represents the African continent through that work. But I would even say, like, being a reader of Conrad beyond just Heart of Darkness, I would even say maybe applies to other works. Like Nostromo could be said to be simplifying like a Latin American reality in a way, and Lord Jim, like I would say like South Asia, like there is this simplifying synecdochial thinking there that I think that he's right. So this makes me think that I should go back to Achebe, perhaps start the book with it. But yes, I mean, that's definitely like the lineage that I'm trying to trace. That it's slightly different, right? But it's sort of like could function as a prehistory of modern racism, racist discourses. And so that is one of the motivations for the work, right? Like definitely. And in your question about like, is the narratio a sine qua non of the scriptio? I would say like in short, yes. I feel like Vives is so dismissive in his book about like people don't understand the difference between them, but it's very clear. And then the way that he like develops the argument, and he's like this masterful rhetorician thinking about logic, sure, like he blends logic more with rhetoric perhaps than I don't know, say I wouldn't say like Rodolfo Agricola would, but there's something there that I think that he captures like the sine qua non of one in the other. I think that he sort of captures, and the way in which each part is supposed to, in a description, to lead to the next one is inherently narratio, even if you quote unquote are describing something that stops time, right? And also like intending like to lead you somewhere, right? It's not just a narratio without purpose. And I think that like I think that your question kind of like captures what my trouble with Vives is, but at the same time I find this trouble inspiring to think about what is happening in the histories that I look at. And the question, like, is racism always synecdochal? I would say I don't want to subsume all phenomena of racism in the modern period, and even like if we would ascribe to the early modern period under this, but I would say that there's something about the discourse of simplifying different ethnicities and races, like through sometimes geographic thinking, sometimes scientific thinking, like depends on the period. And I do think that there is some sort of simplifying operation, synecdochal operation happening, either like as a positive whole that is supposed to encompass everything that comes from, say, a region or a continent or a people or culture, or as the part that is supposed, like, in a Conradian way, according to Chinua Achebe, like a part that is supposed to posit the whole in the clearest way. And I think that there is something about it. Like even like the racial epithets that are used or geographic epithets that are used are sort of like simplifying to a certain extent. And they carry different valences, I would say, than the epithets that refer to religion, for example. Like skin color being like, a part of a body, so to speak, like is synecdochal more than metonymic, so to speak, as like it would be like a discourse that blends racism with like religious prejudice, so to speak. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
No, that's great. I have some other questions, but I want to open the floor. If you have any questions or suggestions, actually, things that you find resonant between the classical training in rhetoric and the points that Leo has actually pointed out in his presentation.
I have a question and a comment.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's a question actually, because Vive's distinction between narratio and description um, made me think about Cabello Balboa and how we understand that. Because Cabello Balboa, as you know, he has so many discourses going on there. So many, like, it's so complicated. And I'm not talking about miscellanea Antarctica or miscellanea Antarctica. I'm talking about verdadera descripción.
Hmm.
Um, how do we cross this line there between both concepts?
I think that's a great question, Kata, and I'm so glad that you bring like another chapter that is part of the synecdoche. And I feel like the verdadera descripción is even. I love the miscellanea, but the verdadera descripción de la provincia de Esmeralda. So for those who may not be familiar with it, it's a work written in 1583. Cabello Balboa like goes to broker a deal between, and you might know the painting I'm about to mention. That goes to broker a deal between mixed race Afro-Indigenous communities led by Afro-descendants. And there are two communities in the Provincia de Esmeraldas, modern day Ecuador. And the painting is Los Mulatos de Esmeraldas, if you want to look it up. But he narrates like the progression through rivers. There's so many like points of touch, right? Like the progression through rivers into the interior, the story of Alonso de Illescas, the prominent leader of that community, Black African, who is there and is depicted like as a tyrant, violent in the beginning of the work, and then you have the progression, and you see him, and there's the absence of Alonso de Illescas in the first 4-5 chapters, I want to say, that is like this image of the history that he's able to tell, how the community was formed through violence and etc. And then when he looks at him, and I'm always puzzled by that encounter, right? Like he even shifts the voice, like yo diría señor, like what I'm about to say is incredible. Let me tell you about this man who's like a Sevillano.
Mhm.
And I do think that there's something there about like this synecdochal way of representing that we trace so well. And that's still the mode of representation that he represents Alonso de Illesca's second in command, Gonzalo Davila. Like he never kind of like transforms Gonzalo Davila in a person like who can play the guitar or something. So there's something there, like racialized discourse happening like in two ways, like two different ways. Gonzalo de Avila being someone who was born in Tenerife, if, by all accounts that we know, would be like Iberian, right, culturally and ethnically. So I'm still like rewriting the chapter of the book about that, but I do think that there's something about like the structure of like the first 5 chapters in particular, and then the encounter kind of upsets because the description, to say what you're saying, like the still description that it still takes into account his story, his life story,
Mhm.
kind of like provides a completely different image that breaks what had been said for the most of the work. But I know that you also think a lot about this work, so I'm eager to hear what you think in that
Well,
sense.
I'm very puzzled always, and I'm exactly right now. I'm writing about this encounter and how it shifts, and because he's trying to construct him as a monster all the time, and now he's admired by he's surprised because this knowledge shouldn't belong to him.
Yeah, and recognizable, right? Like he's a successful example of someone who became Iberian in his eyes. Like he plays the Sevilla, like the la guitarra, like he has so ready to hand. Like he says, here's something I can't quote literally, but it's so in his mind, that background, that you would not believe where you look. But the you would not believe where you look is like still like this the skin color, and then it's like you would not believe that he's Iberian as
Exactly.
he is.
And one more thing. I'm sorry, Lenny. I just want to say something. Um, I was thinking when I hear you talk about Ecuador, I don't like. Can you think about a better term because Ecuador didn't exist till 1822, so saying Ecuador is kind of anachronic in that regard. So I would suggest maybe the northern viceroyalty of Peru or something like that.
In the book I use that, which is a more technical term, but whenever I give talks I want people to sort of
Yeah,
like
I know,
know
I
where
know.
they are. Yeah, no, but it's like northern part of I say viceroyalty of Peru, the
Okay.
northern part, like no, because it's almost like they're like the what we
Wait.
would define as the Nueva Granada, right? Like it's right at the threshold.
And
But
that's a problematic territory as well because it's always then it's forgotten all the time.
yeah, but a crucial place for the ships to come from Panama, so still like very important.
Mhm.
Very well, Lenny.
Hi. Thank you very much, Leonardo, for the talk. I have literally a full page of notes, so I promise I will not take all the time, people. Don't worry. I'll try to reduce, but just so you know, if you want to talk more about it, maybe when in the RSA we can talk more about it.
I do,
Um,
please keep that page.
yeah, okay. So actually, starting from the end, from what you just said not long ago, I think that the main thing with Vives, using him as the rhetorician that you're using, and I understand that you have to choose one, two, three rhetoricians. There are so many at the time in the Iberian world. But the primary thing that you have with Vives is that Vives is very much an Aristotelian. He's going the Aristotelian route. So he's trying to clean up Aristotle from what the medieval times did with it, right, in a certain way, or what the patristic did with it. So I think that's why for him, logic is so important. It's the
Mm-hmm.
dialectic, right? So I think that if you kind of tune down a bit, his logic, or if you go to rhetoricians that are not as worried about that aspect, you're going to, this connect or this subsuming of this crypto into narrative is a lot clearer because it comes from the ancient world, and like doing my homework that Herman asked, like what I thought immediately was, of course, Quintilian.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you have this in Cicero too, but I think Quintilian's a lot clearer. Even though I don't think Quintilian actually talks about this scriptio under this term, but what he's going to talk about is like the vivacity or putting things under
Mm-hmm.
your eyes and things like that, right? And of course, I'm sure you know, but that is super connected with the idea of ekphrasis, which is again what I saw in the excerpts you showed of this work, which of course I don't know anything about because my work is all in poetry. So you're bringing. But then I thought, do you know Eduardo Sienkiewicz, a scholar in Brazil?
No, I don't.
His work. So I think that might be an interesting tip for you to look up his works. Eduardo Sienkiewicz, I can write his name on the chat later,
I was about
but
to ask you. Yeah.
yeah, because his name's not very common. But Eduardo is a historian by training who has been doing a lot of stuff. His main work is on Rocha Pita.
Mm-hmm.
So it's later than what you need. This is 18th century already. But he does it's almost the opposite. When you were talking about your work, I was like, okay, Eduardo does the opposite. He's interested in the descriptio, in the description aspects in the
Mm-hmm.
work of a historian, in the work of Sebastião da Rocha Pita. And I think he also has some stuff about Nuno Marques Pereira. It's a bit before, so it's this passing from the 17th to the 18th, the Compêndio Narrativo. So
Mm-hmm.
Eduardo has been working on this period there. So it's a bit later than yours, but he's very interested in studies of ekphrasis and visuality in the works of historians. So, that could be something that interests you in your work. And to talk about the synecdoche, and then maybe that is all of these are just comments that things that came to my mind as you were talking. There's a lot of things that, just tickled my brain. But I think maybe the question I have for you, of course, and when we're talking, that one of the excerpts you showed, I was like, it's Horace, right? Like I was screaming at where he talks about this idea really of the painting, right? So where the thing of the painting and the carriage, that part of the painting is so Horace, right? Of the Pictura Poesis, that, I mean, it's screaming at us. But I think my main question in terms of the synecdoche is if you've made connections about that, which we showed, which, I mean, I thought it was very interesting, approaching it through the lens of, as you said, rhetoric, but not in the level of the elocutio, which is where usually people think of these figures, right? People think of these figures in the level of the elocutio, and you're looking at them in the level of the inventio and of the dispositio. I think that's what you're doing, right? So have you thought about how this same figure, in this case the synecdoche, but I mean, I imagine you can think of the others too, are working within the explanation of the church and of the what I'm thinking of here is the idea of the colony as part of the mystic body, right? So the colony is like an arm of the mystic body. So it's this confluence of the idea of the mystic body of Christ and the crown, the empire with the crown as the head, as a form of mystic body, because that is also a kind of synecdoche, right? When an arm of the empire is in South America or in Africa, but that body represents the whole, which is exactly what you showed, like how the different parts represent the whole. I think that is a deeply theological, not just political, historical, geographical, but I think it's deeply theological. So I was thinking about if you are, and how you could connect, this theory of the mystical body of Christ transferred into an historical political tool of colonization. Okay, I talked too much. Thanks.
No, thank you, and please keep that paper. I will go to talk more at the RSA. So to answer the question, no, I have not necessarily been thinking about it. But now that you mentioned, immediately a bunch of things came to mind, and I would say one of them, there is this. Oh, thank you for the name. There is this. I should take a second look. What I want to say is I should take a second look at De Rhetorica Christiana by Valdez. Maybe that would be a good place, because that is a work that is produced in the colonial context, is explicitly about theological rhetoric, and books 5 and 6 have sort of recent history of Mexico through the perspective of Franciscans, but also some rhetorical interesting things happening there. But no, I hadn't explicitly made the connection. But I think that what you say is super, super important, because not only are they raised as a rhetorical tradition that is embedded in the classical. Quintilian is all over all of these manuals, even the ones that are simplifying, like Bartolome Bravo, in the end of the 16th century. They're simplifying Quintilian, so to speak. So they are part of the integral part, but also the theological one for sure. Miguel Cabello Balboa was a priest, lay priest, but priest nonetheless. And Christianity is a part.
There is some work that I've seen recently, but I can't for the life of me remember the name of the author. But some contemporary scholar that's talking about that specifically in Mexico, about the mystic body as a colonial tool. If I find it, I'll send it to you, but I can't remember. But in the Brazilian context, Alcir Pécora talks about that in Teatro do Sacramento, which is,
Yeah, well, Anchieta would be another.
Yeah, Anchieta and Vieira, are the ones that are commented, that are, usually the study cases. Just let me also point out one last thing when you talked about the idea of epic and history. As I said, I'm here I'm the one dealing with epic, but yes, the historical epic is such an important element, and I'm thinking about not just, as you said, Lucan, which, sorry, people, touting my own horn. I actually have a chapter written about Lucan as a historian, which came out not very long ago. But so
I'll go to that.
Okay, so but not just about Lucan, not just think about Lucan, which is the one that people think of the most. But I mean, there was a whole tradition of historic epic in Rome, which is different from Greece, that was very important and came through. But I'm thinking specifically in the Portuguese world, that becomes even more important once that the Lusíads are this fundamental, let's put it like that, stone of narration in the Portuguese world, and of course it is a historic epic. So I think the importance of historic epic for the early modern times in general, so Tasso and all of that, but also for the Lusophone world, I think cannot be overstated. So these things I will be extremely connected all the time. So the epic and history, and nobody's going to find strange. And if you think about it, and then I'm venturing into my own territory, but if you think about it, what are called the epics of the colonial times for Brazil, they're all historic. Uruguay, Caramuru, they're all historic. So there's something there. Why is it that even the people who are proposing to write poetry, they're actually writing history? So I think that is something also that kind of, there's a friction there that is more specific, more special, I think, for the Lusophone world. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for this wealth. There's good. Yeah, thank you.
Very well. Other questions? I actually have, well, people, ponder. I also had a question regarding the antecedents of these 16th century endeavors, right? And most particularly, I'm thinking of Leo Africanus, right? And how defining, right, his description of Africa is going to be for the European world. It seems to me, though, that to a certain extent, what you are identifying through these rhetorical figures gestures toward a shift with respect to Leo Africanus. But I cannot quite pinpoint the way that is happening. So I'm wondering if you think this is a valid intuition. Do you see something productive in this? What is happening, right, in this moment, this pivotal moment, moving from the 15th to the 16th centuries, right, in which empire is trying to take on a more hands-on approach, right, and it's also thinking about new types of native informants, so to speak, right? Because that's the case of Almeida, in a way, even though he wouldn't accept it so willfully, right? That's also the case with the Africanus. So, to what extent there is something foundational, right? That may also explain why we find the echoes between the cases you're examining and later forms of 19th century forms of colonialism, for example. So yeah, that was my question.
So, and I explicitly in this book avoid Leo Africanus and Luis del Mármol. Those would be like the two most influential kind of like description de Africa, explicitly in the title and in the mode of offering. And I do think that there is a shift, even though like we can think like we read everything of Leo Africanus, like someone who's writing from the ground but is really writing in another place, like he traveled. So it is, and it's not fulfilling a function of like on the ground observer, but it's fulfilling a function of like, let me tell you about so to speak where I come from. I'm simplifying like horribly, and I apologize for that, but that's one of the things. But it's a vistazo, the Africa. That, more with Leo Africanus, less Luis del Mármol, because there are like 2 volumes of Descripción de África by Luis del Mármol. One that comes out in 1573, and then which takes a lot from Leo Africanus, but kind of like he writes it to say like we need to update Leo Africanus, so to speak. So Luis del Mármol was the one that, if these historians are reading, they're not reading Leo Africanus, they're reading Luis del Mármol. So that's it. And the second volume comes out very late, if I'm not mistaken, 1599. Don't quote me on that necessarily, but like 1599. So that's the second volume that deals with has more Black Africa in it. The 1573 is like very much indebted to Leo Africanus, and it privileges Northern Africa and some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. So, but the reason why I kind of avoid, because I'm thinking of like the on the ground figures, and how that on the ground figures are still like somewhat, and I don't like the word influence, but somewhat influenced by those general descriptions, but are working more with, part of it is like knowledge that they receive from books, maps, atlases, classical works, like you name it, like Descripciones de Africa, like Leo Africanus, I don't see mentioned anywhere, but Luis del Mármol, who basically rewrites Leo Africanus in many ways, is present. So he is indirectly present, so to speak, Leo Africanus, that is. But yes, and it's the shift that particularly makes me not want to write about those two. and I think that you pointed right. Like, so like, it feels like your question was already like sort of like repeating your question is like my way to answer it, but because it is particularly the shift that interests me, and that interplay between on the ground interactions that shape the idea that is, the kind of like almost like a circle of like domains of knowledge and experience as one shaping the other in what they're writing. And then the results, like, so to speak, like the answers that each of them have, if we were to read them according to the figures of thought that I propose, right, the answers are very different. Right. Because the problems on each locality is very different. Like, right, like Wamon is absolutely negative about Black people. Like, and it comes in the end, like it comes later in the work. So there's a lot of work like to contextualize the work between like indigenous, like first indigenous groups, the different ages, then the Incas, which is another like, like nest of wasps that he also deals with. And then like when he turns his eyes to the present, like, okay, like there are Black folks here. What do we do? And I think that the reason why I call it oxymoron for Guamapom is like this temptation of like, the world has changed so much, and to affix stable categories, and then that part of motivates that's part of my explanation, like a sort of rhetorical explanation to explain why he's so against mixing, ethnic mixing, racial mixing, in his view. So yes, so that's a long-winded answer, but like I am explicitly avoiding, and I'm mentioning that in the introduction, that I'm not dealing with those two, because I think that the mode of like deploying or like mobilizing knowledge of Africa is very different in those two. Luis del Marmo travels, and funny enough, my dissertation has a chapter on Luis del Marmo. I just dropped him for the book because of the things that you're talking about. So I deal with some of like Granada as a region between two things, and his synecdochal interpretation in his dealings with North African sovereigns.
I see. Well, thank you.
No, thank you.
Very well. Any other questions? Well, if that's the case, then we can actually wrap up the session a little bit early. But I want to thank Leo one more time for his wonderful presentation. If you have any idea that is still gravitating your mind after this, please let us know. We can always transmit it to him. And thank you so much for making the time to attend this session. And thank you, Leo, for such a magnificent overview of your book. We're looking forward to it. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Germán. Thanks, everyone at Hesperides. Like this, it's truly a treat for me to share my work with you, even though it's like tangentially related. But I'm so glad to have listened. Please let me keep that sheet of paper, and we'll keep talking. Okay. I really appreciate you all. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending this session.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Have a nice day, everybody.
Bye. You too. Bye bye.